celebration of two hallmarks of our democratic society today. I wanted to show you, if you can see it, I'm wearing a Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote that I think encapsulates both occasions. Never underestimate the power of a girl with a book. Today we're celebrating, as was already mentioned, the 15th National Friends of Libraries Week. And the other celebration and the focus of our program is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, proclaiming that the right of US citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. This 19th Amendment centennial, as Rita mentioned, is especially significant since this is the occasion of our country's 59th presidential election. For the first 33 presidential elections, that's more than half, women did not have a constitutional right to vote. We hope that all of you will exercise your precious right to vote and that you will encourage your family and friends to do so. As a reminder, if you'll stop by one of the Friends bookstores or the Colony Clubhouse Library, you may pick up a complimentary vote pin commemorating the women's suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment. As I think was mentioned earlier, the program this morning was the inspiration of our membership chair, Karen Michaud, who unfortunately is not able to participate today, except visually. But she has been working on this program for almost a year. We're delighted to have with us this morning Bonnie Martland and Mindy Johnson from the Temecula Valley Historical Society, who will bring to life two daring women, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont and Alice Paul, who worked passionately over many years for women's suffrage and passage of the 19th Amendment so that all US women citizens would have the constitutional right to vote on November 3rd of this year. We want to thank Mindy for stepping in at the last minute for Karen, and we're so grateful to both Bonnie and Karen for all of their work on this project for months. Before our two daring women begin, we'd like to share with you some brief background about the women's suffrage movement. So please sit back, relax, and welcome to our story. In 1776, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John, who with other white men was creating the Declaration of Independence. Particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies. We are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. From 1776 to 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, is quite a long time, during which hundreds of speeches, signed petitions, parades, rallies, and debates occurred, and they encompassed thousands of women, all to gain suffrage. Why did the right to vote for women take such a long time? Well, think about this. Imagine yourself as a person within a small group of people who literally have all of the power and all of the rights. You have financial power. All the money is yours. You have property power. All the land, buildings, and furnishings are yours. You literally own everything in your own house and business. If you are married, your spouse has nothing. If your spouse inherits property or money or artwork or jewelry, it's all yours. Your spouse must ask for everything. Nothing belongs to your spouse or your children. They can do nothing without your consent. If your spouse works outside the home, the wages belong to you. You can even beat them and injure them if you wish, as it is not against the law. You alone have the right to vote, making sure that things stay this way for you. It's always been this way since 1776 and before. As you can see, This is a pretty powerful incentive to not change things. During colonial times, in the mid-1650s, the Quakers came to America to enjoy the privilege of freedom of religion. They brought their ideas of equality for all, men and women, black and white, rich and poor. Everyone should have the same opportunities to education, to a job, to wages and property, and to vote. In addition, they believed in the eradication of cruelty and injustice such as slavery, thus becoming abolitionists. You can imagine that these ideas did not coincide well with the prevailing beliefs in the New World of America. In 1848, after years of speeches and rallies and debates, the first Women's Rights Conference was held in Seneca Falls, New York, organized by local Quaker abolitionists and suffragists. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott led the conference. They had written the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, detailing the demands of the women's movement. And I do have a printed copy of that here, but I'm afraid because of the glass, it's almost impossible to read on Zoom, so I apologize for that. In those days, the Declaration of Sentiments was considered quite radical, and even today it does seem a bit strident. Basically, women wanted for themselves what men had in the Declaration of Independence. One of the resolutions became the foundation of the suffrage movement, that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves their sacred right to the effective franchise. In other words, the right to vote. 100 of the 300 conference attendees, including 32 men, signed it. However, upon its publication, it was met with derision and ridicule, and a number of the signers asked that their names be removed. So here we are in 1848, and the small group of white men whom we talked about earlier are being asked to share some of their rights. What would happen? Well, what happened was that thousands of women and men joined the suffrage movement to fight for the vote. One such person was Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who's presented today by Bonnie Martland. Alva?
Well, good morning. My name is Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt Belmont, and I'm happy to be here to help commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment that they say gave women the right to vote. Well, I'm here to tell you, no one gave us anything. We worked damn hard to get that amendment passed. And you might as well know from the beginning here that those that had to work with me probably found the task even more daunting. My colleagues said that I was haughty, strong-willed, domineering, opinionated, and always wished to be the center of attention. And that, I think, is just about right. And I make no apologies for it. I have had those traits from the very beginning. My parents called me their impossible child. And very early on, I earned a well-deserved reputation as a holy terror. And I was quite proud of that reputation. I disagreed with rules. I manipulated my misbehavior to get what I wanted. I sabotaged any attempts my parents made to give me a normal education. And I accepted as a matter of fact that I was superior to most other people. Now, I have been labeled the unlikely suffragette. I'm sure because I am rich and socially prominent. Why those facts should preclude me from becoming a suffragette, I really don't know. When I look back on my childhood, I think I may have actually been predestined to fight for women's rights all along. When I was 4, my 13-year-old brother passed away. That boy was my father's favorite child. I know this absolutely because my father said no other child could take his place. And he also made the remark, why did it have to be my son that died? Why couldn't it have been a daughter instead? How about that for a kick in the gut? Father always treated me with indifference, and I could never figure out how a dead son was worth more than a live daughter. I became even more sensitive about the status of females in our society when I discovered how much more freedom to express themselves and to do as they pleased boys had than we girls did. I was beginning to see at a very early age that there was a double standard. After giving it some thought, I decided to quit playing with the daughters of my mother's friends and play with the boys instead. And then I proceeded to beat them badly at their own games. You might understand that this combination of rebellion and daring was not viewed very charitably by my parents. I was born into a prominent antebellum family in Mobile, Alabama in 1853. When I was about 7, Fort Sumter was fired on and the Civil War began. So Father moved us from Alabama to New York and then to Europe, where we spent a few years. Shortly after our return to the States, my mother passed away and my father's health and businesses started to decline. Father moved us to a smaller place, and for a while, I was sent to live with relatives in Virginia. I met my first husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt, on a short chaperoned vacation with some friends to White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. William was the beau of one of the other young ladies in our group. However, after our short sojourn was up, William had proposed to me. When I make up my mind that I want something, I nearly always get it. William was the grandson of railroad and shipping tycoon, Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. When the Commodore died, my husband's father inherited about $100 million, making him probably the richest man in the country at the time. Then he doubled that fortune before his own death only 9 years later, at which point, you may understand, my husband became a very wealthy man. Do you remember that show, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? Well, we lived it to the hilt, and at the height of the Gilded Age. We were part of what was dubbed the Mrs. Astor's Elite 400. We had homes on Park Avenue in New York City, on Long Island, and other places in New York. We traveled extensively on our yacht, the Alva, named for me, of course, and we had residences in Europe. During the summers, we spent most of our time where most East Coast elite did, in the enclave of Newport, Rhode Island. Now, in our group, husbands, of course, took care of the business matters, but we women ran the various households, managed the staffs, put on lavish entertainments costing thousands and thousands of dollars, and ruthlessly manipulated social politics to our advantage. Now, William and I had 3 children, sons Harold and William, and a daughter Consuelo, who married Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. They lived at Blenheim Palace, which is today a World Heritage Site. And yes, the Duke was the cousin of Sir Winston Churchill. From her childhood on, Consuelo and I had a very strained relationship, which is a whole other story. But as we did grow closer as time went on, and she worked with me on occasion to help advocate for women's rights. I divorced William in 1895. Mrs. Astor's 400 were in shock. The reason? Divorce at our social elevation was not done. Why? It put a tarnish on our gilded reputations. The grounds for the divorce were, as you might guess, my husband's alleged infidelities. Then men did as they pleased, and women were expected to accept the consequences. I don't know, maybe it's the same now. But I'll tell you one thing, acceptance was the last thing on my mind. I would not acquiesce to that double standard. In the divorce settlement, I got over $10 million, worth about $310 million in today's dollars, and I also got the deed to Marble House, the grand summer cottage, as we called them, that I had designed and built in Newport, Rhode Island. It was designed after the Petit Trianon at Versailles, and the 50-room building cost me about $11 million to have built in 1892. And here's a picture I can show you of what Marble House looks like. When the deed was done, many of my elite social friends decided I was no longer fit to associate with, and so I was socially ostracized. Nonetheless, a year after my divorce, I married an old family friend, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont. He was a socialite, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from New York, a banker, and a newspaper publisher. All of those assets would stand me in good stead in my suffrage work. And he was also my down the street mansion neighbor in Newport. You might recognize the name Belmont as associated with the famous horse race, which of course was named after his father. I have been quoted as saying, women should marry once for money and once for love. Oliver was truly the love of my life. And when he died unexpectedly in 1908, due to complications from appendicitis, I was not only devastated by grief, I was at a loss as to what to do with my life. I found myself increasingly bored with social maneuverings, and I was tired of associating with the wealthy elite ladies that I had known previously. I figured that they were dissolute and self-absorbed, and for them I had at this time developed a considerable contempt. It was all rather ironic, I must say. Here is a photo of me at about that age. Then, on a trip to Europe, I was inspired by the militant suffragists in England, and I decided to dedicate my time and my money to advancing the cause of women's rights, notably to suffrage and the rights of working women to gain decent standards of work and wages. After returning from a trip to England, I attended a suffrage meeting in New York and was gobsmacked, as the British would say, when I saw only 15 women in the audience. To me, it was abundantly clear that more organization and more publicity were needed if we were going to affect any meaningful change. That realization gave me a new sense of purpose. I still had enormous resources, money and connections, and I felt an urgent determination to get something done to secure equal rights for women. Wall Street and Fifth Avenue society, as I mentioned, settled into Newport's opulent Seacliff Manors in the summer. The city was considered the summer publicity center of the nation at that time. So I hunkered down at Marble House and began to promote the idea of women's suffrage on a grand scale. During summer sessions at Marble House, it became the epicenter for the promotion of women's suffrage. I had an ornate Chinese tea house built on Marble House's lawn, overlooking the Pacific Ocean and Narragansett Bay, and hosted conferences, strategy sessions, and lectures. I commissioned a porcelain tea service, tableware actually, emblazoned on blue and a field of white were the words, "Votes for Women." Here's a photo of the tea house, and it could seat over 100 people, perfect for seminars and so on. And here is one of my original dishes with the words, of course, "Votes for Women." Now, I would on occasion give these away, and you might also receive something that looked like this, the Women's Suffrage Cookbook. Now, to these sessions in the summer, I invited Julia Ward Howe, author of The Battle Hymn of the Republic, Anna Howard Shaw, president of the American Women's Suffrage Association, and other notable suffragettes, not only to attend, but to speak. To raise money for the suffrage movement, I also sold tickets, so attendees could not only hear speakers, but they could tour the first floor of Marble House. Here's a picture of Marble House's ballroom. You can see how opulent it is and why I thought people might be interested in paying to see it. When not in Rhode Island, I worked primarily for the suffrage movement in New York. I funded the Political Equity League to get votes for suffrage supporting politicians in New York. I wrote articles for newspapers. I joined the National Women's Suffrage Association, and I later formed my own Political Equity League to seek broad support for suffrage in New York City's various neighborhoods. As president, I led its division in New York City's 1912 Women's Votes Parade. I continued advocating for women, especially working women, attending rallies, supporting the striking garment workers. I helped them with rent and legal fees, and often even paid their bail. I testified before New York State's Legislative Committee investigating the police, working women, and prostitution in New York City, and I warned them against increased trafficking in girls. It was my opinion that all these ills stem from society's double standard and men's sense of entitlement. In 1913, I returned to England to monitor the activities of English suffragists, also to visit Consuelo, and then to attend the International Congress of Women's Suffrage Alliance in Budapest. In Britain, militant suffrage demonstrations were at their peak at that time, under the guidance of Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, whom I came to admire greatly and would support financially. The English suffragists put everything on the line, as Alice can testify. They organized large-scale demonstrations and parades to publicize their goals, while here in America, simply picketing was considered controversial. I supported their tactics, and I wanted to have them also be done here in the States, because I felt if we pursued those tactics, it would attract the attention of the media. In my opinion, American suffragists had been too conservative and too polite for far too long, and it was time to step things up. When the National Women's Party became effective, one of the reasons I lent them my support was because Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, the founders, had similar ideas of doing what was necessary to get our goals noticed, and they took a national perspective. Though I had been working in New York for women's rights, I felt it was time to turn more of my energies toward making suffrage an election issue on the national scale. So we worked out a strategy that held both houses of Congress and the White House responsible for not having adopted the suffrage amendment, and took them to task for it. In 1914, I brought Christabel Pankhurst to the States and financed her speaking tours. In 1916, I co-wrote with Elsa Maxwell a suffragist operetta titled Melinda and Her Sisters, and I had it staged at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Alice will talk about the Silent Sentinels, who for months picketed the White House demanding women's rights, particularly the right to vote. On the infamous Night of Terrors, demonstrators there were not only arrested, but imprisoned and beaten. After their release from prison, I organized a mass meeting, attended by thousands, to honor those 33 women who had been the victims. All 33 were not able to attend my meeting, but all were honored for their service to their country. I supported picketing in front of the White House in the winter of 1917 and supported women's suffrage. It was the first time it had been done, I believe. But being over 60, I was not prepared to stand in front of the White House for hours in the freezing cold weather just because of President Wilson's lack of enthusiasm for women's suffrage. Instead, I went to Florida and sent Alice Paul a check for $5,000 to pay for any expenses the picketing might incur. The next day, a headline appeared in the New York World. Mrs. Belmont gives $5,000 to attack the White House. I love that headline. Some of my colleagues resented the fact that I was wealthy and socially prominent and had political connections. They worried that those assets gave me undue influence in the women's movement. But precisely because of those assets, I was able to provide American feminists with a mechanism they needed to provide the publicity, to gain access to the popular press, and to get the women's movement on the front page across America. When I wanted to talk to reporters, I would send for them and they would come. When I wanted to say something, I would write a letter to the editor or a news article, and I'd send it, and I could be certain that would be taken seriously by the editors. I was also savvy and successful when it came to fundraising, and rich enough to provide funds to my feminist colleagues when they needed it. I was also very demanding. I expected deference and I expected recognition. It was the least I felt that I was due in return for all my efforts. Well, as you can imagine, tensions arose. But generally, the women that had to deal with me found a way to turn what they considered my disagreeable traits to their advantage, working out ways to use my enthusiasm, my administrative expertise, and my financial benefits to their benefit. Alice Paul is a Quaker from New Jersey. I am a high society, Gilded Age grande dame from New York City. We come from different places, not only physically, but philosophically, and we have certainly had our differences. But still I found, though you can ask Alice, that we could successfully work together because we both supported the same principles when it came to implementing strategies such as organizing public demonstrations and bullying politicians into supporting the idea of women's suffrage. I may be wrong, but I think once the 19th Amendment was passed, Alice Paul would have liked to have stepped back a bit and taken a break. However, I kind of strong-armed her with a promise of financial support, into continuing the fight for women's civil liberties and to work towards eliminating inequality for women in the workplace. After the 19th Amendment was passed, I became president of the National Women's Party, a position I am proud to say I held for the remainder of my life. And I pushed hard for the NWP to initiate an international equal rights campaign. I thought it critical that Americans take an interest in the welfare of women throughout the world. 1926, I think it was, when I learned that the plans were in the works to have the building that we were using in Washington, D.C. as our headquarters condemned in favor of some new construction for government buildings. Nipping those plans in the bud, I purchased that old brick home near the Capitol and then donated it to the Women's Party. Consequently, it would continue to serve as their party headquarters well into the 21st century. And here's a picture of that building. You can see it. At that site, on Equal Pay Day on April 12th, 2016, Alice Paul and I were honored as President Barack Obama established the Belmont Paul Women's Equity National Monument in our nation's capital at that site, calling it a centerpiece for the struggle for equality. Here's a picture of President Obama at that dedication. He considered it a centerpiece for the struggle for equality. I considered it a monument to all the women who worked and continue to work so hard for women's rights. Thank you so much for listening to me this morning. And now let me introduce my co-honoree at that event, Miss Alice Paul.
Well, thank you, Alva. I was born in New Jersey in 1885 to a well-to-do Quaker family and raised in a system of equality. I attended the same schools and had the same expectations as my brother. Until attending Swarthmore College, I had never met a non-Quaker. I quickly learned that life in the rest of the United States was completely unfair to women. At that time, I became an activist and rebel, inspired by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her sentiments, as well as by Susan B. Anthony and her famous words, "Women, do not give up the fight. Failure is impossible." I began working for equality for women, the poor, and the disenfranchised. Like Miss Anthony, I was frustrated and impatient with the state-by-state campaigns and the various indifferent US Congresses and presidents. They had struggled for years as to who was a citizen. After the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865, 2 more amendments were written to clarify rights. First was the 14th Amendment of 1868, which read, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the US and the state wherein they reside. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person the equal protection of the laws." Well, here's the clarification. This applied to men only, not women. Next came the 15th Amendment of 1870, which read, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Again, a clarification. This was for men only, not women. Well, by 1913, when Lucy Burns and I moved to Washington, D.C., we were tired of asking nicely and holding rallies. We decided to become much more insistent and forceful. We started a more radical breakaway suffragist group called the National Women's Party, leaving the more moderate suffrage group led by Carrie Chapman Catt in New York. Well, both Lucy Burns and I had worked with Mrs. Pankhurst in England for votes for women. We had picketed. We had been arrested. We had been on hunger strikes. The English group had been violent, using guns and bombs. Well, as a Quaker, I could not condone violence. So the National Women's Party became one of the first nonviolent civil rights protest groups in the US, but not the last. Our target was President Woodrow Wilson, an avowed anti-women's vote person. Well, using methods from England, Lucy Burns and I created a group of women suffragists who would picket in front of the White House until an amendment for suffrage was agreed upon. Known as the Silent Sentinels, We began protesting silently in front of the White House on January 10th, 1917. This was the first such protest in history in front of the White House, but it would not be the last. Focused on an amendment of the right to vote for all women in the US instead of just by state, we stood there 6 days a week from January 10, 1917 until June 4th, 1919. We held up signs made of cloth saying, here's an example, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" As most protests go, many people did not agree with the suffragist women. People should not protest against the US government, nor should women vote. Crowds would gather and shout insults and throw rotten fruit. But the women remained standing. When the US entered World War I in the spring of 1917, the crowds grew larger and far more agitated. After all, their sons, brothers, husbands were going to fight in France. Protests must stop. The women and our signs were attacked. Later in the spring of 1917, President Wilson brought emissaries from Russia, from the Russian government, that is, to the White House to discuss the war and to convince the Russians the war was necessary to, quote, "make the world safe for democracy." This worked well for us. Lucy Burns and I created a new sign for when the Russians drove up to the White House for their meeting. The sign read, "We, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement." The Russians were not impressed with Wilson, and he was infuriated by the sign and the silent sentinels in general. He wanted us gone from the White House. Well, in front of the White House. So in July of 1917, he had us arrested for obstructing traffic, although we were on the sidewalk. We went to court, we refused to pay the fine, and we were sentenced to 3 days in jail. Back in 1872, Susan B. Anthony had voted in the presidential election, thinking she was a citizen with rights. She was arrested, taken to court, and fined, but she never paid the fine. Meanwhile, as women were arrested and jailed, the next day, more women showed up, 6 days a week. In all, from 1917 to 1919, over 2,000 women participated in this civil rights vigil, often without the knowledge of their families. As it continued, jail terms increased from 3 days to 30, and then to 60 days. Lucy Burns and I were each sentenced to 7 months. Jail was unsanitary with rodents, bugs, and no toilet facilities. Food had bugs in it. Using a page from the English Mrs. Pankhurst, we decided on the dire and dangerous strategy of a hunger strike in November. Considering ourselves as political prisoners, we went to the newspapers to gain publicity. As predicted, the jail warden decided to force feed the women on the hunger strike through a tube forced down our throats into our stomachs. This resulted in injury, pain, and suffering for us. The newspapers took that and went wild. So the plan using white well-to-do women to picket and get arrested eventually worked. Their wealthy husbands, brothers, sons, who were businessmen, doctors, lawyers, even congressmen, went to President Wilson and asked that the maltreatment of the women stop. By the end of November 1917, the arrests stopped. However, the vigils of the silent sentinels continued until the 19th Amendment was passed in Congress. Well, knowing World War I was going to end soon, President Wilson realized that going to Europe to dictate peace articles would not look as well if women in the US did not have suffrage. Women in several European countries had already gained the right to vote. The US was a latecomer to the party. On September 30th, 1918, President Wilson openly endorsed women's suffrage in a speech to Congress. The House of Representatives had approved the 19th Amendment, but the Senate had yet to vote. Wilson told Congress that women had played an important role in World War I. He said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to partnership of privilege and right?" The Senate took no action until January 1919, and it did not pass. However, with a change of leadership in the Senate, on June 4th, 1919, when Congress passed the amendment, the silent sentinel vigils stopped. It took until August 18, 1920 to get the amendment ratified by 36 states, with much lobbying and hard work by the suffragists in each state's legislatures. Tennessee was the final state needed. Finally, on August 26, 1920, it was certified into law. And it reads, Susan B. Anthony, 19th Amendment. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. To commemorate this event, the National Women's Party commissioned a sculpture by Adelaide Johnson of the founding women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. It was placed in the US Capitol Rotunda with a ceremony on the 101st birthday of Susan B. Anthony. It was a proud day for women. Within a short time, however, someone in Congress ordered the sculpture removed to the crypt, a storage room under the rotunda, where it languished for 70 years before being returned to the rotunda. It was clear that despite winning the right to vote in national elections, women were not at all legally equal to men. And that is why I drafted the first Equal Rights Amendment, working to establish rights of financial independence, of property, of custody of children, and the right to be on a jury. This amendment was never ratified nor passed into law. We now have a brief video from the city of Long Beach, California, which provides a short overview of the suffrage movement. Thank you all for your time.
I will go where she has gone. I will carry on. Women's work is never done until our freedom's won. Susan B. Anthony was a friend of mine, although we never met. She rode the rails, spoke of women's travails, and her work is not done yet.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a friend of mine, although we never met. She wrote the Women's Declaration of carry on. Women's work is never done until our freedom's won. Lucretia Mott was a friend of mine, although we never met. She planned the first women's rights convention. In Seneca Falls they met,
And Sojourner Truth was a friend of mine, although we never met.
her speech, "Ain't I a woman?" set the stage where race and women's rights met. I will go where she has gone. I will carry on. Women's work is never done until our freedom's won. Carrie Chapman Catt was a friend of mine, although we never met. She led the suffrage campaigns with her winning plan that led to the 19th Amendment. And Alice Paul was a friend of mine, although we never met. She first proposed the ERA. Equality was the course she set. I will go where she has gone. I will carry on. Women's work is never done until our freedom's won. I will go where she has gone. I will carry on. Women's work is never done until our freedom's won. Until our freedom's won.
All for attending. We're very glad to have been able to talk with you about this today, and I invite you all to ask any questions or make any comments that you might have. I'm sure some of you have been involved in at least the Equal Rights Amendment. And so, does anybody have anything they'd like to say or questions? You're going to need to unmute yourself if you do.